Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR Official 24 channel. Get out of here. Victor finds the evidence and kicks Nikki out of the Newman mansion. The young and the restless. It began on a deceptively quiet evening at the Newman mansion, the kind of hush that only ever settled before a storm, when the chandeliers glowed too warmly and the walls seemed to listen, and Victor Newman stood alone in his study with the weight of decades pressing on his shoulders, staring down at a manila envelope he hadn't known existed until an hour earlier. An envelope that somehow smelled like betrayal, like cold perfume and old lies, and as he loosened his tie with a sharp tug, his instinct screamed that whatever was inside would change everything, because nothing ever arrived in Victor Newman's hands by accident, not evidence, not secrets, not knives aimed at his back, and as he opened it with deliberate slowness, page after page spilling out, bank transfers routed through shell companies, burner phone logs, a falsified medical report, surveillance photos taken in grainy darkness. His jaw tightened and his eyes hardened into that familiar, terrifying steel that had brought Titans to their knees, because every single document pointed not to an enemy across the street, not to Jack Abbott or Adam's latest betrayal or some shadowy corporate rival, but to Nikki, his Nikki, the woman who had sworn loyalty and love through sickness and war, the woman whose portrait still hung in the hallway like a promise. And Victor felt something inside him crack as the realization set in that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a manipulation but a pattern, a careful, calculated pattern of deception that stretched back months, maybe longer, and as memories replayed, Nikki's nervous smiles, her sudden late nights, the way she deflected his questions with wounded eyes, his anger roared to life, drowning out the ache in his chest, because betrayal, to Victor, was the one unforgivable sin, and when he heard Nikki's heels clicking softly down the corridor moments later, he didn't turn around, he didn't need to, because he could feel her presence, like a ghost behind him, and when she spoke his name, tentative, loving, afraid, it only fueled the fire, and he finally turned, slamming the envelope onto the desk so hard the lamp rattled, his voice low and lethal as he demanded, "Explain this." And Nikki froze, color draining from her face as she recognized the documents, recognized the truth she had buried so carefully, and for a split second, she tried to recover, tried to spin a story, tried to say it wasn't what it looked like, that she had been protecting him, protecting the family, but Victor cut her off with a raised hand, his voice rising now, echoing off the walls, each word a blow as he listed the lies one by one, the money siphoned from Newman Enterprises, the secret meeting with federal investigators, the forged report designed to make him look unfit, the contingency plan that would have stripped him of control if he'd collapsed at the wrong moment. And Nikki's tears began to fall, real and desperate, as she insisted. She'd done it out of fear, out of love, that she'd watched him grow more ruthless, more isolated, that she believed stopping him was saving him, but Victor only laughed, a harsh, bitter sound, because in his world love did not come wrapped in handcuffs and legal traps, and as his fury crested, he stepped closer, towering over her, eyes blazing as he delivered the words that shattered the room. "You don't get to decide what's best for me." And Nikki sobbed, reaching for him, begging him to listen, to remember their history, their children, the battles they'd survived together. But Victor stepped back as if burned, gesturing toward the door with a finality that made the air feel thin, and when he said, "Get out," Nikki stared at him in disbelief, whispering that he couldn't mean it, that this was her home, their home, but Victor's voice thundered now, raw with betrayal and pain. "This is my house, and you don't belong here anymore," and servants froze in the hallway as the argument spilled outward, the sound of it ricocheting through the mansion, and Nikki, humiliated and broken, tried one last time to reason with him, revealing that she'd been pressured, that someone had threatened their family, that she'd been trying to outmaneuver a greater danger, but Victor, too consumed by the wound she'd inflicted, dismissed it as another lie, another excuse, and with a trembling hand Nikki turned, each step toward the door heavier than the last, memories screaming at her. From every corner, the staircase where they'd reconciled after divorce, the living room where they'd celebrated victories, the bedroom where she'd whispered promises she believed would last forever, and as she crossed the threshold, suitcase hastily packed by stunned staff, Victor stood unmoving, a statue carved from pride and fury, even as his eyes glistened with something he refused to acknowledge. And when the door finally closed behind Nikki with a soft, devastating click, the silence that followed was unbearable, because kicking Nikki out hadn't brought Victor satisfaction, only a hollow echo that reverberated through his chest, and yet even then, he told himself it had to be done. That weakness invited destruction, that forgiveness would make him vulnerable, and across town, as words spread like wildfire through Genoa City, alliances shifted and whispers ignited. Because if Victor Newman could turn on Nikki Newman, then no one was safe, and Nikki, sitting alone in a dim hotel room hours later, mascara streaked, hands shaking around a glass she couldn't bring herself to drink, replayed every moment that led to this disaster, knowing deep down that the evidence Victor found was real but not the whole truth, because there was someone else pulling strings, someone powerful and ruthless who had forced her hand, someone Victor hadn't yet seen, and as Victor paced his empty mansion, rage giving way to restless dread, he couldn't shake the feeling that by casting Nikki out, he'd played right into an enemy's plan, that the evidence had been meant to isolate him, to strip him of the one person who could still reach his heart, and yet his pride kept him from calling her, from admitting doubt, and instead he ordered an internal investigation, demanded names, swore vengeance, unaware that Nikki, bruised but unbroken, was already making calls of her own, determined to expose the real villain, even if it meant standing against the man she still loved. And as the night deepened, both of them stared into separate darknesses, bound by history, torn apart by secrets, and the Newman mansion loomed like a fortress built on heartbreak, because in Genoa City, love and power were never far apart, and when they collided, someone always paid the price, and this time, the cost was Nikki Newman's place at Victor's side, a loss that would ripple through their family, their enemies, and their own souls, setting the stage for a reckoning that would make this explosive night only the beginning. The fallout from that night did not settle quietly. It detonated slowly, relentlessly, like a bomb whose shockwaves kept expanding long after the initial blast, because by morning Genoa City was buzzing with rumors so sharp they cut through every boardroom, every cafe, every whispered conversation in the athletic club, and at the center of it all stood Victor Newman, seated at the head of his long conference table, surrounded by executives who could feel the tension radiating from him like heat, his silence more terrifying than any outburst, because while Nikki's absence from the mansion screamed scandal, Victor's refusal to explain anything only fueled speculation that something far more dangerous was unfolding behind closed doors. And as he stared at the city's skyline through the glass walls of Newman Enterprises, his thoughts kept circling back to the evidence, to the undeniable signatures, the digital trails, the moments where Nikki's handwriting stared back at him like a taunt, and yet beneath the fury, beneath the betrayal, there was an unease he could not shake, a nagging instinct whispering that Nikki had never been careless, never sloppy, never foolish enough to leave such a perfect trail unless she wanted it to be found or unless someone else had wanted him to find it, and that thought gnawed at him even as he barked orders, demanding forensic audits, phone records, timelines, and background checks on everyone Nikki had spoken to in the past year, because if there was one thing Victor Newman trusted more than love, it was his instincts, and they were telling him this story wasn't finished. Meanwhile, Nikki woke up in the hotel room to the pale light of morning filtering through thin curtains, her head pounding, her heart heavier than it had been in years, because being thrown out of the Newman mansion wasn't just losing a home, it was losing her identity, her place in the world, and as she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her phone filled with missed calls she hadn't yet listened to, she knew she couldn't afford to collapse now. Not when the danger she'd tried to contain was still out there, growing bolder by the hour, and when she finally checked her messages, her breath caught at the sound of Victoria's voice, tight with worry and anger, demanding answers, followed by Nick's, controlled but wounded, asking what she'd done to push their father this far, and Nikki closed her eyes, knowing that whatever Victor believed, she could not tell their children the truth yet, because the truth was a loaded weapon, one that could get someone killed if fired too soon. Across town, Jack Abbott listened to the same rumors with a mix of surprise and suspicion, because while Victor and Nikki's marriage had survived betrayals that would have destroyed anyone else, this felt different. And as Jack sipped his coffee, his mind immediately leapt to the possibility that someone was manipulating Victor from the shadows, someone who understood his psychology well enough to isolate him from Nikki. And Jack didn't miss the irony that Victor had done the same thing to him countless times, and though a part of Jack felt a grim satisfaction at seeing Victor suffer, another part of him, the part that knew Nikki's heart, felt uneasy, because Nikki wasn't a schemer by nature, not on this scale, and Jack made a mental note to reach out, because in Genoa City, enemies today could be allies tomorrow when a greater threat emerged. Back at the Newman mansion, the halls felt cavernous, echoing with the absence of Nikki's presence, and as Victor walked past her portrait, he paused, staring at the image of her smile, painted during a time when trust had felt unbreakable, and for a fleeting second his resolve wavered. But then his phone buzzed with a report confirming that the funds Nikki had diverted had been used to pay a private security firm with ties to international operatives, and Victor's eyes darkened, because this wasn't charity or panic. This was preparation, and preparation meant Nikki had expected something catastrophic, something she hadn't trusted him enough to face together, and that realization hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself. The truth, however, was far more twisted than Victor imagined, because weeks earlier Nikki had been cornered by a figure she'd hoped never to see again, someone from her past who knew her weaknesses, who knew how deeply she loved her family, and who had laid out proof that Victor was being targeted by forces even his empire couldn't easily crush. A slow-moving legal and financial ambush designed to dismantle Newman Enterprises piece by piece, and when Nikki had tried to warn Victor, to urge caution, he had dismissed her concerns as paranoia, blinded by his own confidence, and it was then she realized she'd have to act alone, quietly building safeguards, diverting funds, creating contingencies that could be triggered if Victor was incapacitated or removed, never imagining that the very measures meant to protect him would be used to turn him against her. As the days passed, Victor's investigation uncovered fragments that only deepened the mystery, names that didn't quite connect, transactions that looped back on themselves, digital fingerprints that suggested interference, and late one night, alone in his study, Victor replayed an old voicemail Nikki had left him weeks earlier, her voice trembling as she'd asked him to trust her even when he didn't understand. And for the first time since throwing her out, Victor felt doubt pierce his armor. Because Nikki had always been honest about one thing, her love for him, and as much as he wanted to believe she'd crossed an unforgivable line, the idea that she'd done all this purely out of ambition rang hollow. The confrontation with their children came sooner than Victor expected, because Victoria marched into his office like a force of nature, demanding answers, refusing to accept vague reassurances, and when Victor finally snapped that Nikki had betrayed him, Victoria's eyes flashed with disbelief, because she knew her mother's flaws better than anyone, and betrayal for power wasn't one of them, and Nick echoed that sentiment later, quietly urging his father to consider the possibility that Nikki had been protecting them all, and Victor bristled at their doubts, but deep down, their words struck a nerve, because they mirrored his own unspoken fears. Nikki, meanwhile, found an unexpected ally in Jack, who listened without judgment as she revealed just enough to make the danger clear without exposing the full scope of it, and Jack, recognizing the pattern of a hostile takeover disguised as legal warfare, promised to help her dig deeper, not out of altruism alone, but because if Victor fell, the fallout would consume Genoa City, including Jabot. And as they pored over documents late into the night, Nikki felt a flicker of hope for the first time since being cast out, because she wasn't alone anymore. The enemy made their next move swiftly, leaking a story to the press that painted Nikki as unstable, vindictive, and desperate, a narrative designed to discredit anything she might say if she tried to defend herself. And when Victor saw the headlines splashed across his tablet, his anger reignited, because no matter what Nikki had done, no one had the right to humiliate her publicly, and that instinct to protect her, buried beneath layers of rage, surprised him, because it reminded him that love didn't vanish just because trust was shattered. As pressure mounted, Victor finally confronted the possibility that kicking Nikki out had been exactly what someone wanted, and late one night, he picked up his phone, dialing her number before hanging up just as quickly, his pride warring with his growing fear. Because if Nikki was right, if she had been acting against a looming threat, then every moment they spent divided only strengthened their enemy. And across town, Nikki stared at her own phone, feeling the same pull, the same ache, knowing that reconciliation might be impossible, but cooperation was inevitable. The stage was set for an explosive reckoning, because secrets were unraveling, loyalties were shifting, and the evidence Victor had relied on was beginning to look less like proof of betrayal and more like a carefully constructed trap. And as Genoa City braced itself for the next shockwave, one truth became painfully clear. Victor Newman might have kicked Nikki out of his mansion, but he had not kicked her out of his life. And the war that lay ahead would force them to confront not only the enemy targeting their empire, but the damage they had done to each other, because in the world of the young and the restless, love, once broken, never simply healed. It transformed, becoming either the greatest weakness or the most powerful weapon of all. The tension reached a breaking point when a single, unexpected discovery forced everything into the open, because buried deep within the forensic report Victor had demanded was a metadata anomaly so subtle it could have been missed by anyone less obsessive than him, a timestamp that didn't align, a digital signature that suggested the documents he believed were Nikki's careful plans had been altered after the fact. And as Victor sat alone in his office, the city lights flickering below, he felt a cold realization spread through him that the evidence he'd trusted had been compromised, manipulated with surgical precision by someone who knew exactly how to push him toward the one decision that would hurt him the most. And in that moment, the memory of Nikki standing in the doorway of the mansion, tears in her eyes as he told her to leave, replayed in his mind with brutal clarity, not as a moment of justified rage, but as a victory for an unseen enemy. Without warning anyone, Victor drove through the night to the hotel where Nikki had been staying, his thoughts racing faster than the car beneath him, because apologies did not come easily to Victor Newman, but neither did surrender, and he knew that if Nikki was truly in danger, if she had been forced into a corner, then every second mattered. And when he knocked on her door, hard and urgent, Nikki froze on the other side, her heart pounding as she recognized his presence, even before she opened it. Because there were some energies you never forgot, and when the door finally swung open and their eyes met, the silence between them was thick with everything they had said and everything they had refused to say. Victor didn't begin with anger this time, didn't lead with accusations or demands, but with a single, devastating admission, his voice low and strained as he said he believed the evidence had been tampered with, and Nikki's breath hitched, relief and pain crashing together, because hearing those words meant he was finally seeing what she'd been trying to protect him from, but it didn't erase the memory of being thrown out, of being humiliated and broken, and she told him as much, her voice steady despite the tears, making it clear that trust, once shattered, could not be rebuilt with a single confession, and Victor accepted that, nodding grimly, because he understood consequences better than anyone. They talked for hours, peeling back layers of half-truths and fear, and Nikki finally revealed the name she'd kept hidden, the person who had threatened her, a figure with deep connections and a vendetta that stretched back years, someone who had learned from Victor's own tactics and was now using them against him. And as Nikki spoke, Victor's fury shifted direction, sharpening into something colder and far more dangerous, because this was no longer just about his marriage, it was about an enemy who had dared to weaponize love itself, and that was something Victor Newman would never forgive. By dawn, a fragile alliance had formed, not a reconciliation but a truce forged in shared purpose, and Victor insisted on moving Nikki somewhere secure, a demand she reluctantly accepted on her own terms, refusing to return to the mansion until the truth was fully exposed, and that refusal stung, but Victor respected it, because it was a reminder that power didn't erase pain, and as they parted, there was no embrace, only a look heavy with unfinished history, a promise unspoken but understood, that this war would be fought together, even if their hearts remained divided. As the sun rose over Genoa City, The balance of power shifted once more, because Victor Newman had learned a costly lesson that the greatest threats were not always the ones who attacked from the front, but the ones who knew exactly where to strike to make you destroy yourself. And Nikki, walking away from the hotel with a quiet strength born of survival, knew that whatever the outcome, she would never again sacrifice her own voice to protect a man who refused to listen. And somewhere in the shadows, the true villain watched, realizing too late that forcing Victor and Nikki apart had not broken them, but transformed them into something far more formidable, setting the stage for a showdown that would shake the young and the restless to its core.